The rain was a coward. It fell in a thin, apologetic drizzle, clinging to the penthouse windows like a veil of tears he refused to shed himself. He watched her pack, each movement a precise, clean cut, severing a cord that had somehow wrapped itself around his soul. Her hands, the same hands that had traced the constellations of his scars, now folded a simple cotton sweater with brutal efficiency. "Don't do this, Alara." Julian's voice was a low rumble, a sound that usually commanded obedience from men far more dangerous than the woman before him. Now, it was just a sound, hollow and stripped of its power. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. If she looked at him, she would shatter. "I have to," she whispered to the contents of her worn suitcase. The suitcase itself was a relic from her other life, the one before him, a life of thrift stores and ramen noodles, and a quiet, uncomplicated safety she now craved like a drowning woman craved air. He took a step forward, the expensive leather of his shoes silent on the polished marble floor. The entire apartment, a monument to his wealth and power, felt like a cage, a gilded, sterile prison he had willingly, stupidly invited her into. "Everything you're afraid of. I can control it. I can protect you." Finally, she turned. Her eyes, the color of moss after a storm, were filled with a sorrow so deep it mirrored his own. A smile, thin and brittle as autumn leaves, touched her lips. "You are what I'm afraid of, Julian." The words hit him harder than any bullet ever had. They were true. That was the most damnable part of it all. He was the monster in her fairy tale, the darkness she had to flee to find the light. She zipped the suitcase. The sound was a final, deafening gunshot in the quiet room. She walked towards the door, her steps as measured and resolute as his had been hesitant. He didn't move to stop her. His feet were encased in lead, his body a statue of regret. At the door, she paused, her hand hovering over the cold steel handle. "I wish," she started, her voice breaking on the single word. She didn't finish. There were too many things to wish for. She wished he was a painter, a banker, a baker, anything but what he was. He knew all of it. She opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, not looking back. The door clicked shut, the sound echoing the final, irrevocable closing of a vault. Julian Cho, the man who controlled a silent empire that stretched from the docks of Busan to the glittering towers of this city, was left alone in the rain-streaked dark. He had faced down rivals, stared into the barrels of guns, and buried his own father. But the silence she left behind was the most terrifying thing he had ever known. 3 months earlier, he hadn't even known her name. He had existed in a world of curated perfection and brutalist efficiency. His life was a series of transactions, of calculated risks and enforced loyalties. It was a kingdom built on the bones of his ancestors, a legacy of power and fear he wore like a tailored suit, one that was beginning to feel more like a straitjacket. Love was a liability, a weakness he had long since excised from his emotional vocabulary. Or so he had thought. The moment he saw her, the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't a grand affair, no gala or high-stakes meeting. It was a Tuesday. He was at the Sterling Gallery for a private viewing, a tedious obligation to launder his organization's reputation through the pristine filter of high art. He was bored, his mind already drifting to a shipping container discrepancy that needed his personal attention. His second-in-command, Jae-sun, stood a respectful pace behind him, a silent specter in a suit as dark as his own. Then, she walked past. She was carrying a tray of champagne flutes, her uniform a simple black dress that was likely standard issue for the catering staff. It was ill-fitting, the fabric cheap, but it did nothing to diminish the light that seemed to emanate from her. She moved with a harried grace, her focus entirely on not spilling the drinks. A strand of honey-brown hair had escaped her messy bun and clung to her cheek. Julian froze. It was not a logical reaction. He had seen countless beautiful women, women sculpted by surgeons and dressed by designers, women who threw themselves at his fortune and the dangerous allure of his power. They were polished, perfect, and utterly forgettable. This woman, she was different. She was real in a way that made everything else in the room feel like a cheap forgery. His gaze followed her as she offered a glass to a portly councilman, her smile polite but distant. He saw the faint shadows of exhaustion under her eyes, the determined set of her jaw. She was a soldier in her own quiet war, fighting battles he couldn't begin to imagine.
"Sir?" Jay's voice was a low murmur, pulling him from his trance. "Are you all right?" Julian didn't answer. He simply watched her, a strange, unfamiliar sensation tightening in his chest. It felt like recognition, like he had been waiting for her his entire life without even knowing it. It was the most dangerous feeling in the world. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had to know her. Ilara Vance hated these gigs. She hated the forced smiles and the way the patrons looked through her as if she were part of the decor. But rent was due, her art history textbooks were absurdly expensive, and her part-time job at the Daily Grind cafe barely covered groceries. So she donned the scratchy black dress, pinned her hair back, and ferried tiny, unappetizing hors d'oeuvres to people who wore the cost of her tuition on their wrists. She was just trying to get through the night, her mind a running tally of bills and deadlines. As she navigated the crowded gallery, she felt a strange prickling on the back of her neck, a feeling of being watched, intensely. She scanned the room, her eyes grazing over clusters of people in expensive suits and glittering gowns. Her gaze snagged on a man standing near a grotesque modern sculpture. He was tall, impossibly so, and dressed in a suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed molded to his frame. But it was his face that held her. It was a face of sharp angles and stark beauty, dominated by dark, piercing eyes that were fixed directly on her. A faint, silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny flaw in an otherwise perfect, intimidating canvas. He wasn't just looking at her, he was seeing her, and the intensity of it was like a physical touch. It made her skin flush with a confusing mix of alarm and something else, something she refused to name. She quickly looked away, her heart thumping against her ribs. Who was that? He didn't look like the other soft-bellied, wine-swilling patrons. He looked like a predator who had wandered into a petting zoo. Dangerous. Utterly, lethally dangerous. She made a mental note to avoid that corner of the gallery for the rest of the night. Of course, fate, or perhaps just her clumsy feet, had other plans. An hour later, her tray reloaded with canapes, she was backing away from a particularly handsy art dealer when she bumped into a solid wall of muscle. Or, rather, a man. The tray tilted precariously. Tiny quiches and smoked salmon blinis slid towards oblivion. A strong, warm hand shot out, steadying her elbow, while another deftly stabilized the tray. Not a single appetizer was lost. "Careful," a low, deep voice said beside her ear. Ilara's breath hitched. She knew that voice without knowing how. She turned, her head tilting up and up, to meet the dark, intense eyes of the man from before. The predator. Up close, he was even more intimidating. The air around him seemed to crackle with a silent, contained energy. "Thank you," she mumbled, her cheeks burning. "I'm so sorry." "It's no trouble." His gaze didn't leave her face. He made no move to release her elbow. His thumb brushed against the sensitive skin of her inner arm, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt straight through her. "I'm Julian." "Ilara," she managed, her name sounding breathless and foreign. She tried to pull her arm away, a subtle assertion of her boundaries, but his grip, while not painful, was unyielding. He finally released her,
but his eyes held her captive. "You seem out of place here, Alara." Was that an insult? Her defensiveness, a shield honed by years of scraping by, snapped into place. "And you seem right at home," she retorted, her tone sharper than she intended. "I'm sure you and that $1,000,000 pile of scrap metal have a lot in common." She nodded towards the sculpture he'd been standing near. A flicker of something, amusement, surprise, danced in his dark eyes. A corner of his mouth tilted up in a ghost of a smile. "It's titled Urban Decay." "I suppose we do." Before she could formulate a response, a voice she hadn't heard in 6 months cut through the air, dripping with condescension. "Alara! My God, is that you?" Alara froze. Her blood ran cold. She didn't have to turn around. She knew that smarmy, arrogant tone. Mark, her ex-boyfriend. The man who had critiqued her dreams, belittled her ambitions, and finally dumped her for a paralegal whose father was a partner at his firm. She turned slowly, a polite, brittle smile plastered on her face. "Mark, what a surprise." Mark Peterson looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her generic black uniform with theatrical disdain. He was flanked by a woman in a red dress so tight it looked painted on. "Working now, are we? Still chasing that little art fantasy?" He gestured vaguely at her dress. "That's a practical choice. Very you." The jab was meant to hurt, and it did. It was a direct hit at every insecurity she had. Her lack of money, her simple clothes, her feeling of being an imposter in these glittering rooms. Each word was a tiny, sharp stone. The woman beside him giggled, a high, tinkling sound that grated on Alara's nerves. "It's a job, Mark," she said, her voice tight. She just wanted him to leave. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Right, a job," he smirked. "Well, don't let us keep you. Someone's probably waiting for what is that, a mini quiche?" He laughed, a loud braying sound that drew a few curious glances. "Some things never change." Shame, hot and acidic, flooded her. She felt small, exposed, pathetic. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was tight, her eyes stinging. Then, the air temperature seemed to drop by 20 degrees. Julian, who had been watching the entire exchange with a chilling stillness, took a half-step forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Alara. He hadn't said a word, but his presence was a sudden, overwhelming force. He looked at Mark, his expression utterly flat, devoid of any emotion at all. That was the terrifying part. It was a complete predatory emptiness. "Is there a problem here?" Julian's voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. Mark, who was used to being the most important man in any given conversation, faltered. He looked Julian up and down, taking in the suit that cost more than his car, the palpable aura of command. His bravado wavered. No problem. Just catching up with an old acquaintance." Julian's gaze flickered to the name tag on Mark's lapel. "Mark Peterson, Sterling and Finch." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Your managing partner, David Finch. He's a friend of mine." It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the weight of a death sentence. Mark's face went pale. The smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed panic. "Oh, I didn't realize." "You should have more respect," Julian continued, his voice still unnervingly calm. "Not for her." His eyes met Alara's for a split second, a silent, complex message passing between them. He turned his chilling gaze back to Mark. "For yourself. This display is unbecoming." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't have to. He simply dismissed Mark with a slight turn of his head, a king banishing a court jester. The finality of the gesture was absolute. Mark stammered something incoherent, grabbed his companion's arm, and practically fled, melting into the crowd. The space he left behind was filled with a thick, charged silence. Alara stood frozen, her tray of canapés forgotten. She was reeling, not from Mark's cruelty, but from the silent, swift, and utterly devastating way Julian had dispatched him. It was like watching a shark deal with a minnow. She looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was watching her, his expression now unreadable. The amusement from before was gone, replaced by that same unnerving intensity. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He was rude," Julian stated simply, as if discussing the weather. "And he insulted your dress." His eyes dropped to the simple black fabric. "I happen to think it looks lovely on you." The compliment, so direct and unexpected, sent another wave of heat through her. This man was a walking contradiction, a terrifying protector, a gentleman brute. "It's a uniform," she said, trying to regain her footing. "It's not supposed to be lovely." "Nevertheless," he said, his lips twitching into that ghost of a smile again. "I would like to take you to dinner, Alara." "Somewhere you can wear whatever you want." It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. Her mind screamed, "No! Run! This man is trouble!" He was everything she was wary of: wealth, power, and a darkness that clung to him like expensive cologne. But her pride, still smarting from Mark's humiliation, and a deeper, more reckless curiosity made her hesitate. "I don't even know you," she said, the words a weak protest. "You know my name is Julian. You know I'm a friend of David Finch." He took a step closer, invading her personal space. He smelled of bergamot and something metallic, like cold steel. "And you know I don't like it when men like him speak to women like you in that tone." He paused. "The rest, you can learn over dinner. Friday, 8 o'clock. I'll have a car pick you up." He was arranging her life as if he had every right to. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. "That is incredibly presumptuous," she shot back, finding a sliver of her usual fire. "What if I'm busy? What if I say no?" Julian's smile widened slightly, reaching his eyes for the first time. The effect was devastating. It was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "You won't be busy," he said, his confidence absolute. "And you won't say no." He held her gaze for another long moment before turning and walking away, melting back into the crowd as effortlessly as he had emerged from it. Jay, his silent shadow, materialized at his side, and they moved towards the exit. Alara stood there, her tray finally feeling heavy in her hands, her mind spinning. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but her entire world felt off-kilter. She was terrified, and God help her, she was intrigued. Friday, 8 o'clock. She knew, with a sinking, exhilarating certainty, that she would be ready. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Alara told her roommate, Chloe, a heavily edited version of the story over takeout noodles. "So, let me get this straight," Chloe said, chopsticks paused midair. "Your jerk-off ex shows up, insults your dress, and then this tall, dark, and mysterious billionaire swoops in, verbally castrates him, and then demands you go to dinner with him?" "He didn't demand," Alara mumbled, pushing a stray bean sprout around her container. "He stated his intentions." "Oh, honey, that's billionaire for demand." Chloe leaned forward, her eyes wide. "This is straight out of one of those cheesy romance novels you pretend not to read. You have to go. What are you going to wear?" The question hung in the air. What was she going to wear? The incident with Mark had scraped a raw nerve. Her wardrobe consisted of jeans, worn-out sweaters, and a single, decade-old bridesmaid dress she kept for emergencies. Nothing felt appropriate for dinner with a man who was friends with the managing partners of major firms. I'm not going, Alara declared suddenly. It's a terrible idea. The guy is creepy. The way he just decided everything. A car will pick you up. Is that even legal? It's called confidence, Elle. Something you could use a little more of, Chloe said gently. Look, the guy stood up for you. And he's hot, right? You said he was hot. I said he was intimidating, Alara corrected. Intimidatingly hot. Got it. Chloe grinned. Go, have a free fancy meal. Let a handsome man tell you you're pretty. You deserve it after Mark. If he's a creep, you block his number and have a great story to tell. No harm, no foul. Chloe's logic was annoyingly sound. A free meal, one night. What could possibly go wrong? On Friday, at precisely 7:45 p.m., a sleek black sedan that looked more like a spaceship than a car purred to a stop outside her run-down apartment building. The driver, a man with a neck as thick as her thigh, got out and opened the back door, his expression impassive. Alara stood on the curb, clutching her purse. She had settled on a simple blue dress she'd found on a clearance rack, her only pair of heels pinching her feet. She felt like a child playing dress-up. This is insane, she muttered to herself. She got in the car. The interior smelled of rich leather and money. It was silent, gliding through the city streets with an unnerving smoothness. She felt completely untethered from her own life. The car pulled up to a restaurant with no name, just a discreet lacquered black door on a quiet side street. The door opened before she even reached it, and she was ushered into a space of hushed elegance. Dark wood, low lighting, and the quiet clink of silver on porcelain. Julian was waiting at a secluded corner table. He stood as she approached. Tonight, he wasn't wearing a suit, but a dark cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. It was a softer look, but it did nothing to lessen his intensity. If anything, it made him seem more dangerous, the predator at rest. Alara, he said, his voice a warm, low sound that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. You came. You said I would, she replied, a hint of her earlier defiance returning. He smiled, that devastating, rare smile. I'm glad I was right. He pulled out her chair, a gesture so smoothly chivalrous it felt both old-fashioned and completely natural. Dinner was a surreal experience. The food was exquisite. Dishes she couldn't pronounce, flavors that exploded on her tongue. Julian was an attentive host, guiding her through the menu, making recommendations, never once making her feel unsophisticated. He asked her about her studies, about her passion for Renaissance art. And he listened, really listened. His dark eyes were fixed on her, his focus absolute. It was unnerving and incredibly flattering. She found herself talking more than she had in years, telling him about her thesis on Artemisia Gentileschi, about the way light and shadow could convey a universe of emotion. She, in turn, tried to learn about him, but he was a master of deflection. What is it you do, exactly? She asked, swirling the wine in her glass. My family is in logistics, he said, the answer smooth and practiced. Import, export, we move things from one place to another. It was vague, corporate and clean, but it didn't match the man sitting across from her. It didn't explain the scar, or the way he had dismantled Mark with a few quiet words, or the sheer brute force of his presence. There was a chasm between his words and the truth she sensed simmering just beneath the surface. That sounds simple, she said, testing him. The best things often are. He changed the subject, asking her about her childhood. He was a fortress, and she was circling the walls, looking for a way in. As the night wore on, the wine and the hypnotic quality of his attention began to wear down her defenses. She felt a dangerous pull towards him, an attraction that defied logic and self-preservation. He was a puzzle, a dark, beautiful enigma, and she wanted desperately to solve him. When he drove her home, insisting on driving himself this time, in a low-slung sports car that growled through the sleeping streets. The tension in the small cabin was thick enough to taste. He walked her to the door of her building, the crumbling facade looking even more pathetic next to his obvious wealth. "I had a nice time," she said, the words inadequate. "Did you?" He stood close, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He lifted a hand, his fingers gently tucking the same stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was electric. "I'm not a simple man, Alara." The sudden confession, a direct contradiction of his earlier statement, caught her off guard. "I'm starting to realize that. My life is complicated." His gaze was heavy, searching her face. "Being with me would be complicated." It was a warning, a final chance for her to run. Her heart was pounding, a frantic drum against her ribs. Every rational part of her brain was screaming at her to thank him for the dinner and bolt the door behind her. But she was tired of being rational. She was tired of being safe and sensible and alone. "I think I can handle complicated," she whispered. The look in his eyes changed. The caution receded, replaced by a raw, possessive hunger that stole her breath. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. His lips met hers. It wasn't a gentle, exploratory kiss. It was a brand, a claim. It was desperate and deep and full of a yearning so profound it felt ancient. It spoke of loneliness and a fierce, unexpected hope. Her hands came up to grip his sweater, her knuckles brushing against the hard muscle of his chest. She kissed him back with a recklessness that surprised her, pouring all her own frustrations and long-suppressed desires into the act. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Tomorrow," he murmured, his voice rough. "What about tomorrow?" she asked, her own voice shaky. "I'm seeing you tomorrow." Again, not a question, a fact, a promise. And so it began. Their days and nights became a whirlwind romance set against two colliding worlds. Julian would appear at her gritty cafe, his bespoke suit an anomaly amongst the students and struggling artists, and wait patiently for her shift to end. He'd take her to opulent restaurants, private art viewings, and once, on a whim, flew her to Paris for a weekend just to see a specific painting at the Louvre she had mentioned. For Alara, it was intoxicating. The constant struggle for money, the gnawing anxiety about bills, simply vanished. Julian took care of everything, but he did it with a strange subtlety. One day, her student loan balance was simply zero. When she confronted him, furious and flustered, he was unrepentant. "It was a distraction," he'd said calmly, holding her face in his hands. "I want you to be able to focus on your art, on your studies, on me." She fought to maintain her independence, to keep a piece of her old life. She insisted on keeping her job at the cafe, much to his quiet displeasure. It became her anchor to reality, a reminder of who she was before him. Her friend Chloe was ecstatic, living vicariously through the fairy tale. Her mother Karen was not. "A man like that, Alara, they don't come without a cost," her mother had warned over the phone, her voice tight with disapproval. "All that money? It doesn't just appear. Be careful." Alara had dismissed her mother's concerns as old-fashioned paranoia. She was in love, or something dangerously close to it. She was falling for the man who was surprisingly gentle behind the intensity. The man who listened to her theories on chiaroscuro with rapt attention. The man who looked at her as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. But shadows lingered at the edges of their perfect bubble. There were the hushed, urgent phone calls he would take in Korean, his voice turning hard and cold. There was Jay, his ever-present lieutenant, whose polite watchfulness felt more like surveillance. There were the meetings Julian would leave for, his jaw tight, refusing to say where he was going. One evening, they were walking by the river after dinner. It was a rare, peaceful moment. Julian's arm was wrapped around her, her head resting on his shoulder. It felt normal. Almost. Suddenly, 2 black cars screeched to a halt beside them. 4 men in dark suits jumped out, surrounding them in a practiced, fluid motion. Jay was instantly at Julian's side, his hand inside his jacket. Ilara's heart seized with terror. Julian didn't flinch. He pushed her gently behind him, his body a solid shield. He spoke to the lead man in rapid, guttural Korean. The exchange was short, sharp, and laced with a menace that made the hairs on Ilara's arms stand up. The other man, older, with cruel eyes, spat a reply, his gaze flicking contemptuously towards Ilara. Julian's entire demeanor shifted. The civilized man she knew vanished, replaced by the predator from the gallery. He said something in a low, lethal tone. The older man's face paled. He bowed stiffly, herded his men back into the cars, and they sped off into the night. The entire incident was over in less than a minute. The silence they left behind was deafening. Julian turned back to her, his face a grim mask. He reached for her, but she flinched away.
"What was that?"
she demanded, her voice trembling. "Who were they?"
"Business rivals," he said, the lie thin and brittle. "It's nothing."
"Nothing?"
Her voice rose, laced with hysteria.
"That was not nothing, Julian. They looked like they were going to kill us. Jay had his hand on a gun, didn't he?"
Julian's silence was all the confirmation she needed. The beautiful, fragile world he had built for her shattered, and the darkness she had always sensed poured in through the cracks.
"You have to tell me the truth,"
she pleaded, her hands clenched into fists.
"Who are you? What is this logistics business?"
He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not just intensity in his eyes, but a deep, profound pain, a weariness that seemed centuries old. He knew this moment was inevitable. He led her to a bench, the cold iron a stark contrast to the heat of her fear. "My father started our family business," he began, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "He came from Busan with nothing. He built an empire. He called it logistics because we move things. Sometimes those things are electronics and textiles. Other times..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Other times they are things people are willing to pay a great deal to have moved discreetly. We provide security. We collect debts. We enforce contracts. We are the Che-Hua Syndicate." The name meant nothing to her, but the tone in which he said it told her everything. Syndicate. It was a word from gangster movies, not from her life. "You're a criminal," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "You're in the Mafia." "It's more complicated than that," he said, a weary echo of their first real conversation. "We have legitimate holdings, real estate, tech firms, galleries, like the one where we met. But the foundation is dark." She couldn't do it. Her principles, the very core of who she was, screamed in protest.
"I can't,"
she said, the words tearing from her throat. I can't live like this. I will protect you, he insisted, his voice desperate. I will burn the whole world down to keep you safe. You don't get it, she cried, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her face. I don't want to be protected from your world. I want a world where I don't need protecting. The truth of her words hung between them, brutal and absolute. He had no answer for that. And so, 2 days later, she found herself in his penthouse, the rain-streaked windows mirroring the storm in her heart, packing her worn suitcase. She was choosing the quiet, uncomplicated safety of her old life. She was choosing to save herself. The goodbye was a clean cut, a necessary amputation to prevent the spread of a beautiful, deadly poison. As she walked away from his apartment, from him, she didn't feel safe. She didn't feel relieved. She just felt a hollow, aching emptiness. She had fled the darkness, but in doing so, she had left her heart behind in it. The weeks that followed were a study in gray. Ilara moved back into her tiny room in the apartment she shared with Chloe. She picked up more shifts at the cafe, the familiar scent of coffee grounds and burnt milk a dull comfort. She threw herself into her studies, spending long hours in the library, trying to lose herself in the lives of artists long dead. But he was everywhere. Every black sedan made her heart leap. Every tall man in a nice suit made her turn her head. The city, which had once felt like a place of infinite possibility, now felt like a mausoleum of their brief, intense time together. She would walk past the nameless restaurant, its black door seeming to mock her. She would see a poster for the Paris exhibit at the Louvre and have to fight back a wave of nausea. Chloe tried her best. You did the right thing, Elle, she'd say, handing her a mug of tea. He's literally the mob. You can't date the mob. I know, Ilara would whisper. I know. But knowing and feeling were two different universes. Her body ached for him. She missed the weight of his arm around her, the low rumble of his voice, the way his dark eyes would soften only for her. She missed the man, not the monster. But she was beginning to understand they were one and the same. Her mother called, sensing the change in her daughter's voice. You sound tired, honey. Just busy with school. Did you break it off with that man? Karen asked, unable to help herself. Yes, Mom. A sigh of relief on the other end of the line. It's for the best. You're a good girl, Ilara. You deserve a good, simple man. A teacher or an accountant. A good, simple man. The thought was so unappealing it made her stomach clench. She wanted her complicated, dangerous man. She wanted Julian. The misery of her safety was a heavier burden than the fear had ever been. She was safe, and she was utterly, completely alone. Meanwhile, across the city, in his penthouse fortress, Julian was living in his own personal hell. He had returned to his world, the world of shadows and violence, but the color had been drained from it. The power he wielded felt like ashes in his mouth. The deference of his men, the fear of his rivals, it all meant nothing. He moved through his days like a ghost, his face a mask of cold indifference. He was more ruthless in his business, more decisive, more dangerous, but it was a hollow performance. Jay watched him, his loyal heart aching for his friend and boss. He saw the way Julian would stand at the window for hours, staring down at the city. He saw the untouched meals, the whiskey bottle that was never empty. One night, Julian's uncle Minjun requested a meeting. Minjun was a relic of the old ways, a man who believed power grew only from the barrel of a gun, and that Julian's Western education had made him soft. He'd been a thorn in Julian's side since he took over. They met in the study, a room paneled with dark wood and lined with books Julian never read. Minjun sat across from him, a smug look on his cruel face. I hear the girl is gone, Minjun said in Korean, foregoing any pleasantries. Good. She was a distraction, a weakness. Now you can focus on what is important. He gestured around the room. Our legacy. Julian looked at his uncle, a cold, quiet rage building inside him. This man, with his narrow vision and love of brutality, represented everything that had driven Ilara away. He was the embodiment of the darkness she couldn't live with. She was not a weakness, Julian said, his voice dangerously low. She was the only part of my life that wasn't rotten to the core. Minjun laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Rotten? This rot has made you a king. It fed you, clothed you, gave you power men would kill for. Do not forget that, nephew. Do not let some little working-class girl make you forget who you are. The condescension, the dismissal of Ilara as some little girl, was the final spark. Something inside Julian snapped. For months he had been trapped between two worlds, the one he'd inherited and the one she'd shown him. He had tried to have both, and he had lost everything. He knew in that moment what he had to do. He couldn't change who he was, but he could change the world he commanded. He could make it a world she could live in. You are right, Uncle, Julian said, his voice suddenly calm. The shift was so abrupt it made Minjun wary. She made me forget who I am. But now I remember. He stood up, towering over the older man. I am the head of this family, and things are going to change. The grand gesture could not be a simple promise. It had to be an earthquake. Julian called a meeting of the syndicate's top captains, men who had served his father, men steeped in the old ways. He stood before them in the sterile boardroom of their primary legitimate enterprise, Jay at his side. The Jaehua Syndicate is evolving, he announced, his voice ringing with an authority no one had heard from him before. Effective immediately, we are ceasing all operations related to smuggling, extortion, and violence for hire. Our interests in narcotics and arms are to be liquidated. We will be a legitimate global logistics and investment firm, nothing more. The room erupted. Shouts of disbelief and anger filled the air. Minjun stood up, his face purple with rage. This is madness, he yelled. You are destroying what your father built. You are throwing away our power, our strength. Our father built a foundation, Julian countered, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. A foundation of blood and fear. I will build an empire on it, a legitimate one that will last for centuries, not one that will land my son in prison or an early grave. The mention of a son, a future he hadn't allowed himself to imagine until now, hung in the air. This is not a debate. This is a directive. You will either get on board with the new vision or you will be cut out. And you know what happens to loose ends in our line of work. The threat was veiled but clear. It was the old language used to enforce a new law. The fight was brutal. It was a war fought not on the streets, but in boardrooms, in back alleys, and on bank ledgers. Minjun and his faction resisted fiercely. There were betrayals, attempts on Julian's life that Jay and his loyalists silently thwarted. Julian was forced to be more ruthless than he had ever been, not to expand his criminal empire, but to dismantle it. He cut off old alliances, exposed his uncle's most illegal dealings to the authorities through anonymous tips, and systematically bled the old guard of their power and money. It took 6 months. 6 months of battle, of sleeping with a gun by his bed, of watching his back at every moment. He was transforming his kingdom, burning the rotten parts to the ground so that something new could grow. And through it all, one image kept him going. Ilara's face, her sad, beautiful eyes, as she told him she couldn't live in his world. He was building a new one. For her. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ilara was sketching in the park, trying to capture the way the golden light filtered through the dying leaves. She was better. The ache was still there, a dull throb where a limb used to be, but she was learning to live with it.
She had been accepted into a prestigious graduate program. She was moving forward. A shadow fell over her sketchbook.
"You've improved your use of negative space," a low voice said. Her heart stopped. She knew that voice. She would know it in her sleep, in her dreams, in her grave. She looked up slowly, her hand trembling. Julian stood before her. He looked different, thinner perhaps, with a new hardness around his eyes, but the frantic, hunted energy was gone. He was wearing a simple jacket and jeans, looking almost normal. He was still the most beautiful, intimidating man she had ever seen. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice tight with 1,000 conflicting emotions. "I told you my life was complicated," he said, his gaze searching her face, drinking her in. "I came to tell you it's not anymore." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "What does that mean?" "It means the Jaehua Syndicate no longer exists. There is only the JH Group, a global logistics and investment firm, fully licensed, fully audited." He took a step closer, his hands shoved into his pockets as if to keep from reaching for her. "There are no more rivals, no more illicit business, no more men with guns in the night." She couldn't process it. It was too immense, too impossible. How? "I cut out the rot," he said simply. He didn't elaborate on the war he had fought, on the danger he had put himself in. He just stated the result. "My uncle is retired. The men who followed him are gone. It's over. It's clean." Ilara's mind was reeling. He had done it. He had actually done it. He hadn't just promised to protect her from his world, he had destroyed it and built a new one. For her. The magnitude of the gesture, the sheer force of his will, was overwhelming. "Why?" she asked, the question a breath of sound. He finally moved, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He knelt before her, taking her sketchbook from her lap and setting it aside. He took her hands in his. They were warm, steady. "Because you were right," he said, his dark eyes holding hers, raw and honest. "You deserved a world where you didn't need protecting. And I found that I couldn't live in a world without you. So, I changed the world." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face. The 6 months of misery, of gray, hollow days, coalesced into this one, blindingly bright moment. The separation hadn't been an ending. It had been a crucible, forging them both into what they needed to be. "Julian," she breathed, her voice thick with unshed tears. He didn't need any other answer. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. This kiss was nothing like the first. It wasn't a claim or a brand. It was a homecoming. It was gentle and deep, full of relief and a quiet, profound joy. It was the end of a war and the beginning of a life. It tasted of forgiveness and second chances. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, her fingers tangling in his hair. The tears finally fell, hot against her cheeks. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a joy so intense it was painful. He was here. He was safe. He was hers. He pulled back, resting his forehead against hers, just as he had on that first night. "I love you, Ilara Vance," he murmured against her lips. "I think I have from the first moment I saw you in that cheap black dress." She laughed through her tears, a real, happy sound. "It was a terrible dress." "It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen," he corrected her softly, "because you were in it." 1 year later, Ilara stood in the new, sprawling wing of the Sterling Gallery. This wing was named after her, the Ilara Vance Wing for Contemporary Art. She was no longer a waitress here. She was its chief curator. She wore a simple, elegant silk dress in a deep shade of blue, a dress Julian had picked out for her. It was not cheap.
Across the crowded room, she saw him. He was talking to the mayor, his posture relaxed, his smile easy. He caught her eye, and his smile widened, a private, intimate message just for her. Jay stood nearby, his expression, for once, genuinely content. Julian had kept his word. The JH Group was a powerhouse, but a legitimate one. He was still a king, but his kingdom was one of innovation and commerce, not fear. The darkness was gone, replaced by a light she had brought into his life. He was a redeemed man, and she, no longer the struggling girl, but a woman of purpose and means, had found her security without ever sacrificing her soul. He excused himself from the mayor and crossed the room towards her, his eyes never leaving her face. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Happy?" he asked, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, right over the simple, elegant engagement ring he had placed there 2 months ago. She leaned up and kissed him, a soft, lingering kiss in the middle of the crowded gallery, not caring who saw. "More than you know," she whispered. He was her complicated man, and she had her complicated, beautiful, and finally safe life. It was more than she had ever dreamed of. It was everything. This story teaches us that true love isn't just about acceptance, but about inspiration. It shows that a person's worth is not determined by their possessions or their past, but by their character and their capacity for change. Julian's transformation demonstrates that even someone from a world of darkness can choose to step into the light for the right reason, proving that love's power to redeem is stronger than any legacy of fear. Ilara's journey reminds us to hold on to our principles, but also to have the courage to recognize when someone is willing to fundamentally change their world to deserve our heart. We really hope you enjoyed this educational piece of content and hope that you could understand the moral lessons behind it. It's a powerful reminder that love can be a catalyst for profound personal growth and redemption. If this story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel for more dramatic romances, and share it with someone who believes in the power of second chances. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think of the moment Julian confessed the truth about his family? Was Ilara right to leave him, even though she loved him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And for our next story, who would you like to see find their own unexpected love? Should it be A. Jay, the loyal second-in-command, who falls for a fiery investigative journalist trying to expose his past? B. Chloe, the supportive best friend, who gets swept off her feet by a visiting foreign prince in disguise? Vote now in the comments, and we'll see you in the next story.